Crimson Sprinter tomatoes, which is a semi-determinate variety. They have a very short time to maturity of only about 60-65 days. So they do have a very fast grow habit, and being semi-determinate, they will last a little bit longer into the season than a true determinate, but they will stay bushier than an indeterminate variety. So to get these transplanted, I want to go ahead, because they're so large, or they're getting so big. Let me see if I can show you the roots on these. So you can see the root is already starting to fill the cell, and it's starting to kind of spiral the bottom a little bit. So that's a good sign that we need to transplant these to a larger container. Typically I will transplant tomatoes a couple of times before I put them in their permanent growing condition. I do prefer to grow my tomatoes in fabric grow bags, just because our seasons change a lot from winter to spring to summer in terms of where the sun is, as well as the intensity of the sun. And so I like having them in the grow bags, because then I can move them depending on the season and depending on where the sun is. All right, now, as I've said in other videos, I know a lot of you probably have heard or have been told that you should always wet your seed starting mix or your potting soil before you add it to the container. I'm not going to argue with that. However, I like to store it in this plastic, or this, I don't know, Rubbermaid plastic container, and I don't like to store it wet, and I'm not going to use all of my soil at the same time. So I store it dry, I use what I need, and then I just water really, really well after I have them all transplanted. I have a giant block of soil right in the middle of my container, so I want to try to break this up a little bit, because I don't want any big chunks going into the containers with the seedlings. Now, in terms of how I am putting these seedlings in the containers. So these guys are pretty small. They're only about 2 1/4 inch. And I would typically transplant up to 3 1/2 inch, but because I'm going to be listing these on the website for sale, I need to use these smaller containers for shipping. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and transplant them into these. If they get too large for these, then I will transplant them up, because once they get a certain height, they're not really going to fit in my shipping containers real well anyway. And this is also why I do some succession planting, so that I can keep seedlings going. And any that get too large will either go in my garden, or I will take them to a local farmer's market. Now, another question you're probably asking yourself is, if I started these seeds about 8 weeks ago, which would be 60 days, and these have a 60 to 65 day maturity, why are they nowhere near ready to start producing tomatoes? And that is an excellent question. That is because your time to maturity on tomatoes, and really any of your garden seedlings that you're starting in trays and then transplanting out to your garden, that time to maturity starts from the time that you put them in the ground. It does not include the time that you start them in trays. All right, now here I have 2 seedlings in 1 cell. This is a very controversial situation, because a lot of people, and justifiably so, would tell you not to risk damaging the seedlings by separating them, and just sacrifice one of the seedlings and cut it off. I don't like to do that, because I like to give all my seedlings a chance to live. So if you can get them now where they're not root bound, they're not too badly intertwined, it's not that difficult to separate them. I just very gently grab them from the base of the stem, and you want to be careful, because if you put too much pressure and you break off that stem, it's probably not going to recover. I say probably because tomatoes have always managed to surprise me. But you want to be very careful, handle them by the stem as little as possible, and just gently pull them apart. Now, in terms of putting them in the containers, you have your first set of leaves. These are the leaves that you first saw when the seedling sprouted up out of the dirt. And these are not considered your true leaves. But even if you have true leaves that are going down the stem, you want to plant these tomato seedlings as deep as possible, because they can actually produce roots all the way up their stem. And if you plant them deep, for instance, when I put the root ball in the container, I'm putting it all the way at the bottom of the container, and then I'm filling the rest of the way up with soil all the way up the stem. When you do that, it is going to produce roots all the way up that stem, so that your root ball now becomes the depth of this whole container. Just moving my little markers across. Once I am done, I will create more markers so that each one of these has their own plant marker. I do have a few cells that didn't germinate. Because of the weird weather we've had, like I said, we had, it would get like 80 during the day, 60 at night. I know all you northern gardeners are cursing me right now. And then a couple days later, it would be 35 at night and 60 during the day. And we were going back and forth with that for like a month, and the seeds just didn't know what to do. So I have a lot that are still germinating now. So even though I have these really well-developed seedlings, and then I have some that just have no signs, like some cells that have no signs of life, I'm going to leave them and give them a couple more weeks just to see what happens, because I have so many that are still starting to pop up. And it doesn't really bother me if I have some that are coming up late, because like I said, I do some succession planting because, I've got a lot of gardeners that I'm going to be shipping seedlings to that aren't even going to be able to put seedlings outside until the middle of May. And I don't want, these seedlings will be too big by that point. They'll already be producing tomatoes by that point. So it doesn't really make any sense to save these seedlings to ship in May. These seedlings, really, so another reason why you want to go deep like this is I'm going to have a few days where they're not going to get a lot of height because they're going to be focusing below the soil. They're going to be developing those roots off of the stem. But once they start to develop those roots, they're going to shoot up. And in another couple of weeks, I'm probably going to either need to sell them or transplant them into my own garden. I'm definitely not going to be able to keep them in this size container. So I would say height-wise for these 2 1/4 inch containers, I'm shooting for only about 6 inches tall, because that's roughly the size of my shipping containers. And then after that point, they need to go into larger containers. Let's talk determinate versus indeterminate. Like I said, these guys are an indeterminate, or I'm sorry, semi-determinate variety. They are an older variety, although this is my first time growing them. I do like that they're growing so quickly, because here in Florida, our spring tomato season is very short, because our tomatoes really need to be done by the end of May, because then it's just getting too hot and wet, and they get a lot of fungal issues, and we get a lot of pests. And by that point, really the only thing that is going to be able to produce well are going to be cherry tomatoes. And that is just because they grow so fast and they ripen so quickly. And so the pests really don't have a whole lot of time to be able to get to them. And then in terms of tomato varieties that are going to go through the entire summer, really we're just looking at Everglade cherry tomatoes, which are teeny, teeny, tiny, smaller than a quarter. They're actually more like dime size. Nice little snacking tomato. They do tend to split easily, like when you're trying to take them off of the vine. Very juicy though, and because they're so small, they're extremely prolific, and the pests just can't get to them in time. Birds do like them though. Birds tend to get to them. So this is actually a medium-sized tomato. It's going to be a slicing tomato. Be really nice for salads. And so it's not going to need, I have to be very, very careful. Like I said, I want to make sure that I'm not damaging these stems or root balls as I'm pulling these up. And I actually just watered them before I started this so that the soil holds together a little bit better. And sometimes when the soil's wet, it doesn't want to come out of that cell quite as nicely. But I also want to make sure that my seedlings are not getting too stressed as part of the transplanting process. So a lot of your heirloom tomatoes end up being indeterminates. Indeterminates are your vining tomatoes. And those are the ones that, you know, you may find yourself having to cut the tops off at the end of the season just so the plant can stop focusing on growth and just focus on ripening tomatoes. Your determinate varieties are the ones that are going to stay bushy, but all the tomatoes are going to come ripe pretty much at the same time. Your indeterminates, you're going to have a few tomatoes ripe at a time, but they're going to continue ripening throughout the season. Sometimes if you notice that the root ball is getting a little tight, a little too spiraled around the bottom there, you just want to squeeze it just a little bit so that those roots come loose and it doesn't continue to spiral around the bottom of the container. Now, your determinate varieties are usually the varieties that you're going to want to grow if you're wanting to do a lot of canning. Unless, I mean, you can certainly can indeterminates. I have. Most of what I've grown in the past has been indeterminates. But you end up needing more plants so that you have enough coming ripe at the same time to make a full batch of whatever you're making, whether it be, you know, salsa, tomato sauce, whatever. Because we can't have half-empty canners now, can we? I do have a few other things growing in this tray because I was just going by what was in a seed packet. Because I'm still small, I'm not buying a whole lot of bulk seeds. So I'm still buying things by the seed packet because I don't want a lot of seeds to go to waste if I can't use it all. So I went as far as I could with these Crimson Sprinters, and then I filled the tray with some other things. I do kind of rotate what's in my trays, meaning that I don't want different types of tomatoes sprouting next to each other, because if something happens and tags get mixed up or seeds float around, I don't want to mix up what varieties I have growing. So these are the Crimson Sprinter tomatoes, and then I have, this is cinnamon basil, which is my first time growing cinnamon basil. I'm pretty excited about that. And then these are Purple Beauty peppers, and I only have three of the Purple Beauties that have come up so far, but my peppers are just starting to germinate. Like I said, peppers are real finicky in terms of germination and growth anyway. They like a lot of moisture and humidity for germination, and obviously heat, and they just tend to be slower to grow in general. So you got to give them a little bit more time. The good news is peppers tend to do pretty well for Florida summers. The sweet peppers are a little more finicky. They don't handle the heat as well, but I can at least keep them alive as long as I keep them in morning sun, afternoon shade. That's really the trick to getting most vegetables to survive Florida summers. Now I am going to leave, like I have one tag here for the Crimson Sprinter so that I know this one has a very weird growth pattern. I'm not entirely convinced that's the same kind of tomato, but I'm going to leave it. So if you grow a lot of different tomato varieties, you will notice that some have different shaped leaves, and there's some that are referred to as potato leaf. It just has a different shape And that's kind of what this one looks like. But also it's weird because there's no like, it almost looks like the top got damaged when it was sprouting. So I'm not gonna pull off too many of the leaves because I'm not entirely sure what's going on with it. And it may be one that I just keep for my own collection so that I can grow it out and see what the heck it actually matures to. Because it looks a little bit like a potato leaf variety, and the rest of these do not have the potato leaf. The potato leaf is just fatter, and it looks like a potato leaf if you've grown potatoes. I don't remember exactly how many seeds I started with, but if I'm basing off of one seed per tray, or I'm sorry, one seed per cell, and there's 6 cells in each of these packs. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's roughly 30 seeds. 4 across, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 20 seedlings out of 30 seeds, which isn't bad. I know everyone always wants to get 100%. I don't stress it too much. There's so many things that could go wrong, or that can just throw off germination, growing from seed. It's why so many people end up buying seedlings from a nursery, because they've had just a rough time trying to get stuff started from seed. And it's taken practice on my part. I used to buy everything from the nursery. But I'm just stubborn like that, so. I'm actually pretty excited that I've got such a good germination coming from the cinnamon basil, because trying to grow Italian basil from seed has been a giant pain in the tuchus. So, not that, like, it germinates great. And maybe it's because this is the cinnamon basil, so it's got like a different scent to it. Maybe it's more pest resistant. But it seems like as soon as my Italian Genovese basil sprouts, something eats it. And I did start some other Italian Genovese basil before I started all of this. And I think it was just old seed, because I don't think any of it germinated. But it was probably seed from 2017 or something like that. It's stuff that I bought like pre-COVID. And I figured might as well try it. I put a lot of dry soil in this, so I'm making sure I water these really, really good. Also, the tray that I have under them does not have holes. So anything that, in fact, I'm just gonna pour the rest of this in here. Anything that drains through is gonna hold in the tray, and it's gonna give these seedlings and the soil a little more time to soak it all up. Plus, having that water in the bottom like that is really going to encourage the deep roots. I do not generally recommend keeping tomatoes like sitting in water like this. They don't like to be constantly wet. They really do better if they can dry out a little bit between waterings. But March is also one of the driest months of the year here in Florida. And so I want to make sure that these guys get as much water as they need. And because we are getting pretty warm during the day, we're not getting a lot of rain, it's very low humidity, they're drying out very quickly, even with daily watering. So that's why I'm going ahead and putting them in these solid trays just as a safeguard. I am keeping an eye on it, making sure that they're not staying in standing water. If I notice that the water is just sitting there and it's not getting soaked up every day, then I'm either going to pull them out of the tray, or I'm going to drain it out, switch them to a tray with holes, something along those lines. The problem is usually if the water is sitting there like that, it either means they got too much water or they're not taking up the water for some reason. So that's something else I have to investigate. All right, so that is it. I've got these guys transplanted up into the larger containers. Like I said, they will probably only stay in these containers for a couple of weeks, because once they start to get those roots going, they're going to take off very quickly and probably even be ready for me to put in the ground or put in my grow bags for any that I'm going to be growing myself. All right, thank you for joining me, and happy gardening.